you know, if we go back to the 50s, we had real country music. Then in the 60s, you still had real country music, but then this guy, Billy Sherrill, started coming in, and it started homogenizing. How's that for a good word for it? With the Johnny Paychecks and some of George Jones stuff. And what does this New York kid know all this country stuff for? I don't know. In any event, then you go into the 70s, then we go into the 80s, and now we get rock and roll. And the country music of today is really not country music. Am I right or am I wrong? Or what's my perspective with that?
Well, no, I think it's a very interesting subject. You know, the homogenizing, which became known as the Nashville sound, you know, was they were trying to compete with pop music. Sure. And, you know, with the strings and the background vocals and everything. And in fact, one time I was fortunate enough to get to know Chet Atkins towards the end of his life. And I interviewed Chet one time. And I asked him, I said, what was the Nashville sound to you? He said, that was the sound of us trying to keep our jobs by selling records. Which I thought, and the other answer was, the other time I asked him, he just shook his pocket full of change. He said, that's the Nashville sound.
Right.
But I think the evolution goes in cycles. And what's happened is the music that you think of as country music still exists. And there are still people making that kind of music, but it's in the Americana and the bluegrass categories. The country genre has been influenced by all these, the different sounds and everything that, you know, and the audience kind of went with it. You know, I think as the country audience demographic got younger, the audience was more open to those different sounds. I think one of the interesting turning points was in the late 80s and early 90s, when there was kind of a resurgence with people like Randy Travis and Alan Jackson, and Keith Whitley was one of those. And then Garth Brooks came along, and Garth did something that no one, in my opinion, had ever done before. And I saw it firsthand because I knew him before he was famous. I knew who he was. And we had some mutual friends. And he was the first country singer to take the rock and roll frontman attitude, whether you want to call it Black Oak, Arkansas, or, you know, Robert Plant, or whichever rock and roll frontman you want to think of, that, hey, Cleveland, hey, how you doing? Hey, what's going on? We're going to have fun tonight. No one had ever done that in country music. And we did a year in 1990 where Garth Brooks did 20 minutes, Don Williams did an hour, and Reba McEntire did 75 minutes. And in 20 minutes, Garth Brooks would wear the crowd out in a way that I had never seen before in a country setting. Thankfully for us, with Don Williams, whose music is very laid back and is all about people listening to the lyrics and believing every word the way he sings it, because he's just telling you a story. And it was a perfect setup for Don, because the exhausted audience would kind of just sit there in a daze, and then just Don would hypnotize them. And then, you know, and then Reba would come along and do her country pop kind of thing. But the crowd, I guarantee you, the next day, for the next few years, the day after the Garth Brooks concert, those people were at the record store going, I want that Garth Brooks record. And the songs have held up. I just saw him do the stadium here in Nashville about a month ago. The songs have held up, which have allowed him to break all the rules and have his own audience that has nothing to do with radio. But Garth, to me, was the transition of presenting country music in a much more in-your-face kind of way. And it gradually took decades, but it gradually, the music absorbed those things, but at a slower rate, I think, than the performance mentality that Garth brought to it. But I think it just opened it up to a whole other audience, and a younger audience didn't have those preconceptions of what country music was supposed to sound like.
Well,
but I think it's a great question, and it is, that music still exists. You just have to look a little harder for it.
Well, you know, it's interesting you bring up this topic, because my theory on it was always that, Well, you had younger artists. You had Lucinda Williams, Keith Urban, Ryan Adams, Steve Earle. They grew up on rock and roll. They grew up on the Rolling Stones. So naturally, that was going to have an influence on your music. Just like Willie Nelson had his influences in blues and folk and things like that. So it's a natural progression. But you mentioned Garth Brooks. What it had a profound effect in New York City because we had a movement which was known as the Lower East Side Opry. So now everybody shed their Ramones leather jackets and their Beatle boots, and they started talking with a Southern drawl and wearing cowboy boots and Western wear. And I actually got to work in that genre, and I still do to this day. There's still a country music hold here, an Americana music hold. I think Steve Earle lives in the village. He lives.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I've known Steve a long time. In fact, he took my place as Guy Clark's bass player.
Oh, okay. And that music, you're absolutely right. It has transformed itself into Americana music, but I think it's also, you're influenced by what's around you. And if rock and roll is around you, then that's what you're influenced by. And could you comment on this also? I think probably one of the big turning points in Nashville had to be when Dylan came down to do Blonde on Blonde, and then of course Nashville Skyline, because now it was hip to go to Nashville. Then the Stones went down there, right, and then went to Muscle Shoals as well.
Absolutely. No, that was definitely a huge turning point.
Yeah.
Because what they called the A-team, the original group of studio musicians, they were not hillbillies. They were mostly jazz players.
Absolutely.
Who could play anything. And, guys like Wayne Moss and Charlie McCoy, who worked on those early records with Dylan, they were like, yes, just, do your thing, man. We're right here with you. And I think that gave a certain credibility.
Right.
That people just didn't know about. But, Nashville's always had lots of different kinds of music.
Right.
And it's just the success of country overshadowed a lot of things. And in the early days of that country success, the city they were embarrassed.
Right.
Because Nashville was known as the Athens of the South before it became Music City, because it was a very education oriented place. But part of that was Fisk Jubilee, Fisk University singers, and the Jubilee singers in the late 1800s started touring the world singing gospel music. And rumor has it that when they went to Paris and sang for the Queen, one of the Queen's minions said, "You sound so great. You must be from the city of music." And some people say that was the first time the phrase Music City came along.
Okay.
There was a DJ on WSM who came up with that. The same guy, I think, who came up with the grand, like, you've just heard the opera, the Metropolitan Opera, now the Grand Ole Opry here from Music City. But there's always been this diversity. The session players of that day, Hank Garland, was a great guitar player. He went up to Newport and played the Newport Jazz Festival and made records with Gary Burton when Gary Burton was just a teenager. So there's always been that thing, but I think Dylan crystallized it. And and Blonde on Blonde, the credits are a little more vague as to where everything was. Whereas by the time Nashville Skyline came along, he was very transparent and proud to be making records in Nashville. And it was definitely a game changer for the city and in the community, for sure. It's like, hey, what kind of record you want to make? We can do it all.
Well, Bob Johnson really was the catalyst behind that, because if you read up on it, Dylan was not happy with the New York session players. They weren't getting what he was doing. And he said, let's go down to Nashville. And Dylan's manager was not too thrilled about that, because it would cost money to go to Nashville, and he didn't want to lose control of Bob. And of course, when he went to Nashville, they cut Blonde on Blonde like that.